Really what I wanted to do is just share with you a little bit what the Potentialife project is all about, how it started, what it is, and then we can discuss what it might mean to each of you. And really the way to do this for me is just to describe the two founders. So Tal and I met 4 years ago. Tal, who you probably have heard of, he's quite a well-known Harvard expert in the field of positive psychology and leadership. He's also a very well-known author. And he's known as Mr. Flourishing. He's also known sometimes as Mr. Happy as well. So Tal and I met, and my background, I was actually at McKinsey for 20 years. And of course, that's anything but happiness, as you all know. But I was, one of the things I was doing at McKinsey was leading our leadership function. So trying to answer the question, how do you develop a vibrant group of leaders globally? What do you spend the money on? And what do you hope to get in return? And what types of programs? And Tal and I met 4 years ago, and we actually started just reflecting a bit on this in our first ever meeting. And we decided that we would do something together. And the thing that caught us was this recognition that in an organization today, either you do a program that is an intervention program that's high impact, but probably on a very small scale. So you can take some people and give them a coaching intervention or an elite program. And that's, why not? That's fine. Or you try and do things on a large scale, but they really don't seem to have much in the way of impact. You can give people books. You can bring in gurus like Tal. You can bring in gurus to come and talk. And so you have scaling without impact, or you have impact without scaling. And we sense that is a challenge, because the organizations that we're in these days, as we discussed on the panel, are changing. And we think that everybody needs to be leader. And so what I'd like to do is really just share with you the journey we went on and some of the science that we aggregated together to support a new way of thinking about developing leaders at scale in organizations. And the first big sort of observation that we made is this, and we talked about this in the panel. We call this disaggregation. Our world is disaggregating. Now, some people would say our world is a VUCA world. Some of you use that. I forget what it stands for, but it kind of means volatile and uncertain and complex. And what's the A for? Probably ambiguous. There we go. So our world is changing rapidly, and one way of actually thinking about how that plays out for us in organizations is actually to look at, and this actually came up in the panel. I thought it was actually quite a nice leading from Inga. Think about sort of 3 generations in the workplace. So we have the millennial generation. Now, the millennials, they're going to be working for 50 years, unlike some of us, I hope. And the thing about them is that they're probably going to be doing 35 or so jobs or roles in those 50 years. That's kind of the world that they're operating in, which is quite different to perhaps 1 generation ago, my generation, where you might do 5, you might do 10 jobs in a career. And then 1 generation before that, where maybe you do 1 or 2. And so in the space of 2 generations, something very, very fundamental has happened. And there's lots of explanations for it, and we talked about it before. We talk about globalization, technology, new business models. It's really, really important. They're the things that result from globalization and technology. Everybody's going after the sweet spot in the value chain and designing global slivers around those sweet spots. Well, that creates a lot of change. And it's totally different to the former world, where structures were stable and we had stability, and loyalty was a prized value, and we had command and control. And if we just pause for a second and just reflect on what that means for organizations, and just think for a second about in the good old days when you would organize a firm, you'd organize a company. What do you actually do? What did we used to actually do? What we used to actually do was define roles. And those roles needed to be precise, because those roles fitted into a structure. And it was a structure that created value. That was kind of the organizational concept. And so in a sense, deviation from role was a bad thing. because that made the structure less efficient. Now, the thing is, because things are moving so quickly, we don't have time to do that anymore. The pace of change is speeded up so much that by the time it would take you to reorganize in such a way, it would be time to reorganize again. And so as a result, organizations have space in them. Those roles, definitions have space in them. They have wiggle room everywhere. And that wiggle room is actually oxygen. And that oxygen is opportunity for expression, for initiative taking, for leadership. And so if you break it down, we have high speed of change, which is creating space in roles. And that space is creating this opportunity for leadership throughout the organization at every single level. And that's, for Tala and myself, when we thought about Ruthless, we thought, well, hang on a second. If you actually think about that seriously, that has some fairly fundamental implications for how we think about organizations. The first one being, obviously, we need to change the label or the meaning that we assign to the label leader. We need to forget about this idea that leader is the folks at the top. And we need to rebrand that, rethink that. Everybody is a leader. And I sometimes say that when in what I do for a living, I visit maybe 5 or 10 institutions a week. So I see 5 or 10 receptionists every week. I've got nothing in for receptionists, but I'm just, it's just a story. And but I have to say that the spectrum of behaviors you see is extraordinary. I will see some receptionists who I'll go up, I'll give them my name, I'll say I'm seeing so-and-so at 10 o'clock. They will leave a voice message, and then you kind of assume that you have to wait, but you don't really know whether the person's got the message, so you kind of get a bit anxious because you think you might be late now. That person's doing their job, right? And then the other end of the spectrum, I have people who have Googled me before I arrive, so that when I arrive, they recognize me, and they say, hello, Mr. Ridgway. That's nice. Yeah. And then they walk me to my meeting, and as they do so, tell me about the history of the company they're in, so that when I get into the meeting, I have a real sense of where I'm at. Now, both those people are doing their job, but one of them is doing it in a totally different way, a different model of leadership than the other. And that's why we think that leadership applies at every level in the organization. So leadership for everyone, that's just the first sort of, wow, let's just think about that for a second. And then the second sort of thought is to say that, I think the way we think about the link between strategy and people also needs to change. Because we tended to see, classical world, linear world is to say, well, strategy is how you decide you're going to win. So clever people coming up with clever ideas about how you're going to win. And then you decide how you then need to organize yourself, and that includes leadership, right? But if everybody is on fire in your organization because you found a way of enabling everybody to be a leader, then really the causality inverts. It doesn't cease to be the case in this. We just add a new causality the other direction. Just think of the possibilities. Not only can your leaders enable your organization, they can help you define your strategy. And what that kind of really means is that people, leadership, has just got a whole lot more important for your success. And I actually think that's why it's a great era for HR. It's the era of people. It's the end of the era of structure. And now we're in the era of people. So these initial thoughts were really why Tal and I started thinking about this. And what we decided to do was just to initiate a research project. So this was 4 years ago, and just trying to answer the question, if you were to try and come up with a capability that would allow organizations to develop these leadership behaviors at scale, what would it be, and how would it be different to what's out there today? And by the way, when we speak to companies, it was obvious to us that organizations do struggle to develop leaders. We've yet really found an organization that tells us they've cracked the code, and you tend to see the same types of observations. People say that they're struggling on scaling. How many companies have I spoken to that tell me something along the lines of, each year we put X people through an elite leadership program. We say, well, that sounds good. And how many people do you need to put through in total? And they go, oh, well, we've got 473. Oh, you put 15. Okay, so, okay, good. Scaling is a challenge. Or relevance to real-life context. You send people away for a week, and those week programs can be fantastic. I can tell you we did plenty of them at McKinsey. And by Friday afternoon, everybody's worked up into a frenzy, and the Stockholm Syndrome has set in, and you don't want to disappoint the evaluators, so everybody's filling in 7s on their evaluation sheet and declare victory. It's great. But then you come back to work on Monday morning, and you kind of have that slightly empty feeling in your stomach, because you kind of know that nothing actually has changed. And so the challenge of making change relevant to real-life context is a very real question. And then the third one is how do you actually make change actually stick? How do you go beyond the honeymoon effect? So we thought we would need to solve for these three things. So what I'd like to do now is share with you what is really an integration of different bodies of positive psychology, trying to shed some light on the question of what lies underneath the science of what successful people do more of in terms of behaviors. And the way we integrated this is to present this in a contrast. So what I'd like to do is contrast what we call from average. In reality, it's all of us. It's what a lot of us spend a lot of our time doing. And contrast that with what we call the tip of the stem. These are the moments when you're outperforming. The tip of the stem is, in a plant, it's the bit where you have the most genetic action, so we call that the tip of the stem. And we integrated really 5 domain areas. Now, I must say we were humble integrators of the evidence here. We're not trying to push any single scientific theory. What we were doing is integrating the evidence. And so we can present this in a confident but humble way in reality. And you will be familiar with some or perhaps all of these. The first one is strengths. And let me start off by asking a question. And I'm actually not going to ask you to raise your hand, but I want you just to have a think about this for a second. Which do you think will help you improve the most? Knowing more about your strengths or knowing more about your weaknesses? And while you have a think, I'm just going to have a quick drink of water. So I guess, hang on, let me just drink. So I guess you figured it's a leading question, right? So you're probably saying, well, the answer is obviously strengths. But interestingly, the majority of people, and it's Gallup among others who've done lots of research on this, the majority of people, when you ask this question, they answer, it's more useful to know more about my weaknesses. Why? Because they believe, like a lot of us do, that the way to progress is by eliminating your weaknesses. A lot of us have grown up in cultures where that's what we're led to understand. However, the science tells us something totally different. There are a group of people who are actually playing a different game. They're playing to their strengths and they're playing to their passions. In simple words, they're doing what they like doing and what they're good at. I'm good at it and I like doing. Challenge is, a lot of us don't even know what our strengths are. And even if we knew what our strengths are, we would struggle to put them front and center in our day-to-day lives. So there's a journey of transformation to be had from being in the mindset of I progress by eliminating my weaknesses to one where I'm playing to my strengths, my passions, and getting close to that moment of magic when you can knock the ball out of the park, whatever your way of doing that is. So that's the first of the key things you see much more of in the most successful people. The second one, health. This has everything to do with energy and stress and the relationship between the two. And there's 2 thoughts here. The first one is great leaders are always energetic people. But if you just reflect on that for a second, when we see an energetic person, when I see an energetic person, I tend to say, wow, that's an energetic person. And you kind of assume it's kind of in their DNA. That's just the way they are. You're energetic because you're energetic. And that's the mistake. Because we can all be more or less energetic depending on how we manage our energy, whether we're doing it proactively or implicitly. So why is energy interesting? And the reason why energy is interesting is because it unlocks the secret when it comes to stress. The big opportunity here is stress. Because stress, and there's big body research on this, stress, dirty secret, stress is good for you. Stress helps you be more productive, more mindfully engaged, more creative. But you can only embrace stress if you have the energy that allows you to embrace it. The alternative is to be in the mindset where I'm feeling drained, and when I'm feeling drained, what do I want to do? I want to eliminate that stress. I want to strip that stress out. And so the opportunity is to go from that to this, which is the thought of being much more embracing when it comes to stress. And here's just a simple thought for you. Whether it's what happens each day or each week or each year, just ask yourself the question, at the end of each day, let's say 6 p.m., how close are you to being just as energized as you were at 9 a.m.? Or at the end of each week, Friday afternoon at 5 p.m., how close are you to being as energized as you are at 9 a.m.? And what would you have to do during the week in terms of exercise, nutrition, sleep, taking breaks, dealing with those things that disrupt your energy, making sure you have enough time for restoration? And then take it one step further. Think about 2016 compared to 2015. What would you have to do each year so that next year you are just as fresh next year as you are this year? And then 2017 and 18, what kind of breaks do you have to take? And I have my own personal story here. My wife is French, so I lived in France for 20 years. One of the things you might be familiar with is the French. Any French people in the room? Yes, there is. Yes. So I'll be very respectful as I tell this story. So, the French take the month of August off, basically. And when I moved to France, I actually didn't like that idea. I thought it was an affront to my personal freedom. I want to be able to take my holiday when I want. But I actually started doing this French thing and taking a month off. And for me, it was actually very, very revealing. Because I noticed that the first 2 weeks of that month were just like any old vacation. But then in the third week, I was starting to have some rather strange ideas about different things I could be doing. And then in the fourth week, I was starting to implement those ideas. And when I got back on the 1st of September, I was in a completely different place than I'd ever been before in terms of freshness. Now, I'm not saying that we all need to take a month off. We all have to find our own model. J.P. Morgan said, I can do a full year's work in 9 months, but not in 12 months. That's cool. That means he was taking 3 months off. But we all have to find our own way of doing it. But this idea, just what are you doing to manage your freshness so that you can embrace stress and all the productive opportunity around that? Let's go back to the third one. So the third one we call absorption. And this is this idea that we all have vast swathes of our life spent in a state of mindlessness. It might be you're working on writing a document, sitting in your desk, writing a document. But you know what? You're also, because your football team plays, you're also checking the scores. And then you're also obviously doing a little bit of email, and then obviously a bit of Facebook, and then the news. And what's going on in your mind is your mind is always on its way to somewhere else. That's the mindless way of doing stuff. If you were able to mindfully engage in writing that document, you might discover that instead of taking 3 hours to do it, you can do it in 45 minutes. And those of us who travel a lot and work on planes will have probably seen the strange benefits of working on planes, where a lot of those distractions are taken away from you, and it seems to be magically productive. So learning actually practicing this skill of mindfulness is very, very important. And I think the important point here is the world has done enough talking about mindfulness. Enough books have been written on mindfulness. And by the way, when I travel around the world, and whenever I arrive in an airport, I look at the size of this self-help section in the airport as a measure of a nation. And obviously, the number of mindful books in there. I think there's enough. The opportunity around mindfulness and absorption is about doing it, just getting on with it. And really what it's about is going from an external locus of control where you're juggling a bunch of external stimuli and not quite sure when peak performance happens, to rather taking responsibility for yourself, bringing that control inwards, and mindfully engaging to make whatever it is you have, making your ordinary extraordinary. Nobody asked which airport. Maybe that's a question for later on. So relationships. So this actually talks a little nicely to the whole conversation on millennials. So, think about, in the old world, why relationships mattered. In some ways, and I don't want this to sound cynical, but in some ways, in the old world, the reason why we had relationships in organizations was because they allow us to hold on to our power base. But that world is no longer relevant because we don't hold on to power for very long these days. And in any case, we have multiple stakeholders. And in any case, we have networks that last for longer than our power base. That's why, to some extent, the millennials have got it right. They've understood the power of the network. So what really matters these days is less about your ability to lead through power and influence, but your ability to lead and engage in your relationships with two very important drivers. How much positive energy you're injecting into those interactions, and how true to yourself you are, how authentic. And there's bodies of research on both of these. And the interesting thing about positive and authenticity is they can come together. So, if you're being somebody who's highly authentic, but not very positive, you could say you're being a driver. Or if you're spending time being very positive, but not really being true to yourself, then you can say you're being a pleaser. The opportunity is to what we call the benefactor zone, which is when you're being both positive and authentic. And the point isn't that we all are in one of these segments. The reality is we're all in all of these segments. The question is, how can we shift the balance of time so that we're more in the positivity and authenticity zone? And the fifth of the five things is the thing that really pulls it all together, and it's the why question. So answering the question, what answer do you give yourself when you're answering the question, why am I going to work tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning. What do you actually say? Now, some people will say, I'm paying the rent. Others will say, I don't really know exactly, but I do know that I want to open up that beach bar in Spain or something. All of which is fine, but the opportunity is less about looking for activities with meaning, like beach bar in Spain, but more about reframing, coming back to what it is that you're doing tomorrow morning and looking for the meaning in that. And there's been some great research, for example, in hospitals, looking at doctors and looking at the cleaners, the janitors, and trying to answer the question in those two populations, when they look at their work, is it a job, is it a career, or is it a calling? So, of course, as you would expect, plenty of doctors view their work as a calling. They are, after all, doing very noble work, saving lives. But interestingly, many janitors also see their work as a calling because they have been through a process. For example, maybe they're telling themselves, well, I'm creating a clean environment, and that clean environment is allowing lives to be saved. And interestingly, many doctors have also lost their sense of calling and view their work just as a job. Because maybe they bought that second home and they've got that second mortgage, and now they're actually worried about, the reason why they're going to work is because they're worried about whether they're going to be able to pay the second mortgage. And they've just done maybe too many of those bypass operations. So the opportunity here is really around reframing, and there's two important things here. There's meaning and commitment. And in the same thing, before we saw authenticity and positivity, what really matters to live purposefully is to do things that are meaningful to you, but you have to commit to them as well. And it's actually one of the opportunities with the millennial generation about combining meaning with commitment. So this is really the synthesis of our year's work of research on really what the science tells us about what the successful people do most of. And what our program does, and I'll move on to that in a few seconds, is to allow you in organizations to help your people go from wherever you may be, broadly speaking, on the left-hand side of the page, to somewhere on the right-hand side of the page. Now, of course, if Tal and I had just stopped our research here, we'd been just another couple of guys trying to tell the world what good looks like. So we knew that that in of itself wouldn't be enough, but it is a necessary step. So actually, let's have a look about what is it you would do if you were to design an intervention program that takes this as a blueprint, but actually thinks about how do you change behaviors. And I think this will come back a little bit to the question before on mindsets. So the way we think about this is, think about it for a second. A lot of intervention programs in organizations simply do not deliver. 60 billion was spent in North America on training, and a lot of people are wondering what was the real impact of that. And one of the main pitfalls that change programs fall into is that we associate learning with behavioral change. We think that by teaching stuff that somehow you change. And what we're really doing is making an assumption that change is simply a cognitive process. So, for example, when I did my MBA many years ago, there was a module on leadership, so I studied leadership. And so at the end of my MBA, I knew a lot more about leadership. But I hadn't become a leader. I just knew more about leadership. So that's the trap that a lot of intervention programs fall into. They focus on the cognitive side of things. And now, if you actually look at the science of how we all change behaviors, we have to go through 3 steps, not 1 step. And each step is fundamental. And let me just bring to life perhaps each of these 3 steps. The first step, and this is well-known behavioral science, the first step is the step where you get a whiff of the possibilities. You're discovering things about yourself, and you're trying stuff out. Some of it's going to work for you. Some of it's not going to work for you. Some of it you're going to like. Some of it you're not going to like. You're not committing to anything. You're just experiencing it. You have to go through that phase. Why? Because when you then go into the cognitive change phase, where you're defining choices about what you want to change, if you haven't been through that experiential phase, the cognitive phase would just be a somewhat theoretical exercise of words on a page or boxes to be ticked. Whereas if you've experienced stuff, you can actually incarnate those thoughts. They actually mean something to you. You're actually making changes about yourself that you've had a chance to experience. So you have to unfreeze before you go to change. But if you stop at the change phase, then there's no reason why anything would stick. And so we're interested in lasting change. And here we need to recognize that lasting change doesn't happen just because you want it to. Self-discipline isn't enough. That's why, for example, our New Year's resolutions don't work. Because when you make a New Year's resolution, you're making an assumption implicitly that next year you'll have more self-discipline than you had this year. And we don't. Therefore, they don't work. So the way in which we make lasting change is not about just wanting it, but it's about establishing rituals. And this has to go with the structure of the brain and how you establish new pathways in the brain. You practice, you make perfect, or you make your habits, and then your habits make you. You have to go through that. And there's actually some interesting research done on willpower. I'll just ask a question. Now I would like you to raise your hands. How many of you would like to have more self-discipline? Come on, raise your hands. Some of you haven't raised your hands, but most of you did. Now, of course we would. But let me just share this research with you, and some of you may be familiar with it. It was some research done looking at willpower, and basically the people who were doing the research were invited to go into a waiting room and told to wait for 10 minutes before being taken out of the waiting room and being asked to do a very, very difficult mathematical test. As they were waiting in the waiting room, somebody came in and laid down on the middle of the table a plate of warm, freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. And they said, "Don't eat them." And the people didn't eat them. They said, "Don't eat them because it's actually for another test later on, so you mustn't touch them." So 10 minutes go by, and you're kind of like, you can smell these things. I can smell them now. I wouldn't mind one, actually. And then you sort of, and then you go and do this mathematical test. Now, imagine the same test, but instead of having chocolate chip cookies, the person comes in and lays down some rather sour-smelling, freshly oven-baked beetroots, or whatever they are, radishes, beetroots. Don't smell so good. 10 minutes go by, then they do the mathematical test. Now, the real test was to see, in these two groups, which group would resist longer before giving up, because the test was so difficult, there was no way you could do it anyway. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to which group actually lasted longer on this? Shout. I want to hear a shouting voice. The radish group lasted longer. Anybody else? Well, yes, indeed. Because the cookie group, they've used up all their self-discipline in trying not to eat those cookies. Yeah. So they get into the test and they go, I can't be bothered. Yeah, that's what's going on. So we have what we have in terms of self-discipline. Willpower isn't the answer. The answer is way power. It's establishing the rituals and habits and reminders. And so it's the combination of thinking about the whole, I'll go back to this page here, thinking about this whole change process. This is how we change. And this affects both behaviors and mindsets. Is ABC, is affect, behavior, cognition. They all go together. And it's by focusing on the behaviors that affects your mindsets, which then affects your affect. And so that's really the journey that in the Potentialife program, we're taking each participant through. On each of the 5 things we saw before, so strengths, you will go through a journey of unfreeze, change, refreeze. Now, before we go any further, you're wondering, how long does this take? Well, you know what? This takes 9 months. Because real change, dirty secret number 2, real change takes time. The microwave dinner approach to behavioral change is not the right one. And I can tell you, I spent many years trying to put people into microwaves and thinking that they'd become leaders. It doesn't work. You have to take the time to go through this process. This is how we change. It takes 6 to 9 months. So far, I've presented this kind of approach, some thinking on the science. One thing I haven't done, and we're running out of time, so I'll just present really one more slide, is just shed some thoughts on how do we use technology in all of this, because I haven't talked about technology so far. And this is really how we answer the question of how do you take this from one person to 50 people, or from one person to 1,000 people. And really, we have 2 components here, and they work together. The first thing is we have, and let's just, perhaps I'll present this at a sort of slightly more abstract level. The great thing about technology is it allows you to collect data about yourself. And so it allows for individualization or personalization. So just imagine the difference between going through a learning program where somebody's telling you that strengths are important, and a behavioral change program where, sure, you're being told that strengths are important, but then you get to see your strengths data, and then you re-engineer some aspect of your strengths profile. That's a totally different experience. And it's the way we use an app to collect data, and really what we're doing is we're doing life logging. So over the course of a week, you spend a few minutes each day backfilling your day and logging what you're doing, and then answering some questions relating to your leadership profile. For example, how much you're using your strengths, or how meaningful is what you're doing, or how committed are you to it, or are you bored, or are you anxious, or are you engaged? And you can get a very granular mirror of how you live your life. And every single moment of that day will be revealed. Even that time at 9:30 in the morning, you're looking back, I can't for the life of me remember what I was doing at 9:30 in the morning. Well, you're going to have to think about it. And say, oh yeah, that's right, I was with Dave from accounts. Yeah, and wow, God, that's so boring. So you put in, I was with Dave from accounts, and I was really, really bored. So we collect, I hope there are no Dave from accounts in the room. I was actually doing a kickoff once a couple of months ago where there was a Dave in accounts. I felt really embarrassed, so I just remember that. I have to change the name. So this idea of the app, fit for purpose, to collect data, to give you a mirror, a granular mirror of your leadership profile. And of course, we can run the app multiple times, so you can also see your progression. The second technology aspect is simply the fact that we can put modules online. And this is what allows us to not only have an individualized experience, but have a scalable experience. And so if an organization wants to put 1,000 people through a leadership development program, and they're spread all over the country or all over the world, then we can do this because they access these modules online. And then just a word on these modules. What is a module? Because we're in the business of change and not in the business of learning, these are not learning modules. And this is not a program to try and make you smarter. This is not a PhD program. This is a behavioral change program. So each module is all about getting you to change a behavior. Every single week, by the way, when you do this program, you will be changing a behavior. Of course, you're going to learn a ton of stuff too. It's just that is not the primary objective function. So these are the two important pieces of technology. I'm actually going to pause for breath now, because if I go any further, this is really going to look like a sales pitch, and that wasn't my intention. I wanted to spend more time on the science. So I'll just pause for breath and maybe open up for some questions. And just I think we have at least, well, the 5 minute, the 5 minutes is still okay, right? So we're okay for a few minutes. So I'll just, maybe before doing that, just to sort of summarize, what to take away on Potentialife. So, we're talking about the right behaviors. You saw the framework at the beginning. We call that the SHARP framework. This is the science of what successful people do more of. We're talking about behavioral enablement. We're not trying to make you smarter. We're trying to get you to change. It's scalable and it's personalized, and that's where the technology comes in. It's in context, because what I haven't mentioned is this is not some kind of program where you're taken out and then come back in. You're kind of doing it as part of your life. And then finally, because we have the data, I haven't talked about this, this is all measurable, so we can look at impacts using the data and link it to an organization's strategy. Let me just pause. It gives me a chance to grab some more water, and I think it'd be great just to open up for a few questions. Yeah, hi.
In terms of your intervention program,
Yeah.
how do you keep people committed to that? Because that sounds as if you've got this app,
Yeah.
right? And you've got to feed into this app at the end of every day or whatever.
Yeah.
People are busy lives, commuting, whatever.
Yeah.
What's the incentive for people to actually do that on a day-to-day basis?
No, so it's a super question. So, and it really goes to the heart of one of our design criteria. This has to be an engaging experience, otherwise, we're all wasting our time. And so, let me just shed a few thoughts on what this program actually is. So, this is a 9-month program. So, whatever it is that people are doing, they have to be willing to stick with it for 9 months. A couple of observations. Firstly, the data actually has a slightly, and this may have something to do with all of our vanity, but the data has a slightly addictive side to it. You're logging on each week, and you're going to discover something new about yourself. So that actually has a sort of a stickiness to it. The second thing, and this is perhaps the most important thing, is the third dirty secret of this program is, and this goes back to the very beginning, and Tal, this is actually a well-being program. And the observation that Tal and I made at the outset was that flourishing leadership and flourishing, leadership and well-being, in our disaggregated world we're in, it's actually the same thing. It's two sides of the same coin. Now that's actually a very important message, because what you're doing through this program is helping people live their lives better. You know what? It feels nice to be more energized, and it feels nice to know more about your strengths, and so on and so forth. And so one of the things we find is that momentum actually builds as you go through the program, because people are enjoying the experience they're having. I think the other important thing is to think about how you position this with respect to the company strategy. And this thing has to be positioned as an opportunity for leadership of self, and not as something that's anti-leadership in nature, in other words, a compliance tool. If you have people doing this out of a sense of compliance, because they've been told to do it, or because our corporate strategy says this, this, and this, and we want you to be like this, and this program is going to be like this, then you have a challenge with engagement. And so if we meet those conditions, we actually find that the levels of engagement are actually very high for this program, because it's about yourself, and it's a gift to yourself, and it has a lot to do with well-being. Hi.
Just a question on the data, which
Yeah.
is fascinating.
Yeah.
How many people have you put through on your app so far?
Yeah.
And have you thought about integration with geographical location, diary, with email,
Yeah.
and any of the forms of data that you've got, so you find an overall view of the individual?
Yeah. No, well, I mean, we're in the thousands in terms of numbers. And so when we deploy within companies, the largest deployments we're doing are within an individual company between 1 and 2,000. So this might be a national company in the UK that wants to put all of their managers through, and is spread throughout the country. Some of the smaller ones are maybe 50 people or 100 people. So the scale of deployments vary. The interesting thing is the opportunities for evolving this and getting closer to how we actually, to a lot of the tools that are getting much sharper in terms of how we measure ourselves. So soon we'll have patches that actually do measure your stress. So you won't be declaring whether you're stressed. You will have a tool that's actually going to tell you when you're stressed. So that all of those integrations are fascinating evolutions. There's just one caveat. Is about the opportunity for reflection that goes within there. So if I take the example of strengths, think about, I'm sure many of you have done a strengths finder, right? Probably lots of times. What happens when you do a strengths finder? So some of you may be in companies actually do strengths finders, so I'll be, again, cautious of what I'm saying, but what can happen when you do a strengths finder is you see a set of words on a page. Some of them work for you, and some of them may not work for you. The challenge is when you do these diagnostics is to really incarnate them so that they actually become yours. And we find that you actually need multiple different diagnostics, and then you do your own triangulation to make your own sense of it. And that's when you do the triangulation that you make sense of it, and it actually becomes yours. And so the one caveat with respect to these tools that will get closer to actual measurements is we don't want to lose that cognitive process of triangulation as we go through that. And I think it's possible, but we need to embed that into the way in which we use those tools. Yeah. Hi.
I was just wondering, how have you implemented it in other organisations? Just reflecting back to the beginning in terms of everybody's a leader.
Yeah.
So is your philosophy to put the top 20 or top 50 leaders/managers through the programme, or the whole organisation?
Yeah, so we had an initial philosophy, which we've subsequently thrown in the bin. Our initial philosophy was that somehow it was the lost generation of middle management, perhaps the folks that didn't quite make it to the top, but they have so much to give. If only you could find a way of setting them on fire. But ordinarily, these are people we don't invest in. And so we thought that would be a sweet spot. And you know what? It is a sweet spot. And so we do a lot of deployments which are really around the middle management, but also include the top level too. So we do from CEO down to including. So that might be 400, it might be 1,000, and it might be 28, depending on the size of the companies. So that's clearly one answer to the question. A lot of other companies have already taken their thinking much further and actually thinking, this notion of everybody's leader. They already know that their front line, so in a retail industry, their store managers need to be leaders. Remember we used to say Britain was a nation of shopkeepers. And then we went to a world where we got rid of all our shops and we had superstores. Well, the balance is going back now with online plus convenience stores. Well, we need to reinvent a model where we have a nation of shopkeepers. And so enabling leadership in those frontline environments is very important too. So what we found is that what we have to do is actually have a matching dialogue, actually, where we actually listen to where the unmet need is. And then shape something that fits that. But because it's scalable and it really applies to any population, that's not really an issue.
Angus, we're going to have to stop you there.
Yeah, no worries, thanks.
Thank you, Angus.
Thank you.